Hey there, I'm Sasha Souza, and I have been in the creative events industry for over 25 years as the CEO of Sasha Souza Events, producing some of the most trend-setting and creatively colorful events that you've seen in magazines, online, and in books. I'm also a digital CEO course creator, mentor, and I serve the industry through my Creative Collective monthly membership. I am excited to have you join me for the podcast for creatives, where I can share the biggest lessons and the biggest wins of my business and my creative friends. Let's go. Hey guys, so today's podcast is titled Driving the Dollar Down. And this title has sort of been on my mind for a while because it came about from a conversation that I had with a photographer friend of mine probably a couple of years ago now, but I keep thinking about that term, drive the dollar down, drive the dollar down, drive the dollar down. And it feels as if we are an industry of people who drive the dollar down. We don't support other people in what they charge. I've been told by people in my own industry that what I charge is ridiculous and how I charge is ridiculous, which I think is utterly ridiculous for you to tell me how I should charge my client, and for you not to be open to hearing how I charge. And while this isn't about how I charge or what I charge, this is more about your thought processes in pricing and where you really screw the pooch, and how people feel like they're making enough money when they get to a certain dollar amount. So stay with me here for a minute, okay? So here's the deal. So talking to my friend who's a wedding photographer, and he's saying to me that, the common complaint of people in the event industry, there's so many newbies, and all these newbies are doing is driving the dollar down. And I'm saying to him, yeah, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people with side hustles. There's, especially in parts of our industry that have a low barrier to entry. And those low barriers to entry are where you don't need to buy a lot of equipment, or you don't have to have a whole lot of staff. So the low barrier to entry positions are things like wedding planner, event designer, photographer. Not that those don't take mad skills, because I know they absolutely do, but it's an easier thing for somebody to say, oh, I photograph weddings on the weekend, or for a planner to say, oh yeah, I do day of events, and I also work for X company. This is my fun job. And so you'll hear that, and that's somebody who does it for fun. They don't actually have to do it for business. And when they have to start doing it for business is when they start to think about what's the money look like, and how many events do I really have to do in order to make the amount of money that I really want. So, all right, so follow me here. So Richard was talking to me about driving the dollar down, and how he was super frustrated because he found himself competing with a variety of part-time side hustle photographers. And they were all charging, I think he was telling me like $1,700 for a 10-hour event. Now, let's just be really straight, right? So $170 an hour seems like a reasonable amount of money, right? When you're talking about billable hours. And if it were limited to the 10 hours on the event day, then you'd be like, okay, well, I can totally get behind that, $170 an hour. So the problem is that when you're driving the dollar down, and when you're thinking about your pricing, and whether or not you're at the low end, the medium end, or the high end, you're always most likely going to be undercutting somebody, right? But figuring out those billable hours is really important. So, and how you bill those hours for people based on what you work. So executives, and I have friends who are executives at a number of different types of companies, they bill out, their billable hours are anywhere from $650 to $1,500 an hour. And then you have attorneys and things like that, where they are also billing billable hours, $350 an hour, and up, and paralegals and assistants and things like that, where they bill out at a couple $100 an hour. Event planners tend to bill at $50 an hour, which is insane. And sometimes they'll get up to like $100 an hour, about $125 an hour. They're like, ooh, I don't know, like that's getting outside the range. For professional service and for somebody who has the expertise, it's actually not. So we undercut ourselves so much. So when I'm talking about billable hours, I'm talking about all of the things that you're going to have to pay out in order to have a business in the first place, right? So people don't realize that they have all of these other things. They just think, oh, I've booked, 20 weddings this year, and my side hustle money is, $34,000 and at $1,700. And they don't actually think like, oh, what all has to go into that, So it's not uncommon for them to come in hella cheap and not realize it until they start to, if they ever figure out what their cost of goods sold is. And those are things like the overhead and the software and the equipment, the website and the advertising, the phone consultations, the time with the client, the time selling the client, all of the phone calls with the clients you don't get, timeline reading and creating and emails and accounting. And you have to figure out all of that time. So your billable hours, to a client, you have other things too, like your time in actually talking to them to book them in the first place. So you're doing yourself a massive disservice if you aren't actually thinking in the long run, like what you want to make and backing that out hours wise and charging a healthy hourly rate. And who you're really screwing are your peers. So here's the scenario is that you've been in business now, you've been a newbie, so it's, quote unquote, you have completed 40 weddings. If you're a photographer, you've completed, 10 or 15 weddings as a planner, or 20 weddings as a floral designer, or whatever you might be doing. And so you're not really that new anymore, right? You've decided that $1,700 isn't enough. You've upped it to like $3,000. So you're stepping in the right direction. You're moving in the right way. But then the main complaint from people as they move up the echelons of the industry is that now they start complaining that the newbies are coming in and taking the work and undercharging. It's a really funny cycle. And I've been doing this for 25 years. So I've seen it. I've done it, at the very beginning. Oh my God. Yeah. I was booking full service event planning for $850 in 1995. And I couldn't believe it. I booked my first $3,000 job. I was in Toontown at Disneyland. And I called and checked my voicemail from the payphone. And I had a voicemail from this bride who I'd been waiting to hear from, who was going to give me $3,000 for full service planning for her wedding. And I came flying out of the photo booth in Toontown and couldn't believe that I was going to make $3,000 to plan an event. Full service. And I spent $400 or $500 hours working on her event easily for $3,000. So it was not enough cash, right? For the amount of hours that I'm putting in. So you have to consider all of the things that you put into the business before you just establish a willy-nilly number and think what your market can actually bear, because your market might be able to bear more than you think. And I say this from solid experience for myself, in that I always thought the market could only bear an X dollar amount for event planning and event design and such. And there's always outliers, right? There's always outliers who charge more than that, and their clients are often looking for somebody that has that level of service. If you aren't going to have that concierge level of service, you are going to want to stay out of that upper tier type of vendor, because you won't be able to provide the services that they're looking for in exchange for the amount of money that they're paying. So if you want to be more in the middle range, and that's totally okay. Listen, I will never tell you where you should sit within the range of pricing for your own business. I will just say this: don't undercut people in the same area, right? So don't come in and say, oh, well, I'm now, $1,000 for full service, and I'll basically do everything, including deliver your gift bags. Like, that's not cool, And I understand being hungry and wanting to do events and get experience, but that isn't. You still have to be valued, and you still have to feel valued. So don't sell it hella cheap. So I actually had a really kind of cool story where I was actually at Wedding MBA a couple years ago, and I was standing in my booth talking to people about what I do for mentoring and selling and signing some books and things like that. And I'd just gotten off of the Cottonwood stage, which is the big stage. And I'd given my presentation. And I came back, and there were these girls, and they were waiting to talk to me. And they were so proud of themselves. It was palpable. And they were quite literally vibrating when they came up. And they were super happy and excited. I was like, hey guys, what's your name? And I wish now I remember their names, but I don't. And I always say, tell me what you do, where are you from, give me some info about you. Totally friendly conversation. And they said, oh, well, we're from the LA area, the Inland Empire area. And they said, we are brand new. And I was like, okay, well, what's brand new? Because some people think under 5 years is brand new, but explain to me, what do you consider to be brand new? And they said, we just did our first wedding. And I was like, oh, congratulations. That's awesome. You are like super new, like right out of the cooker new. And they were like, yeah, oh my God, it was so exciting. And I said, tell me about it. Like, tell me what you did. And they were like, yeah, it was a day of client. We know there's no such thing as day of, but you get it. I was like, yeah, okay. So they're talking to me, and they're saying how they completely transformed this parking garage into this event space. And they were telling me all about it. And it sounded pretty cool, not gonna lie, right? And I thought, good for you guys. You guys worked your tookuses off on that day and took the client's vision and made it exactly what they wanted. And, I gotta give you big fat kudos, because that was probably a really tough job. And they said, yeah, oh my God, we charged $1,700. And oh my God, it was so exciting. And I said, each? And they're like, what? And I said, was it $1,700 each? And they were like, no, it was $1,700 total. And so I pull out my phone, and I said, okay, so I just want to give you a little, can I give you some advice? I try to ask people if they're not a client or they're not part of the Creative Collective membership and they're not in a hot seat, I try to give them permission, right? I want permission from them to kind of coach them a little bit. And they were like, yeah, okay. So I said, okay, so tell me, were both of you there on the day? And they were like, yes. I was like, okay, so how many hours were each of you guys there on the day of? And they said, we were there for 9 hours, right? And I said, okay, so you're there for 18 hours total for both of you. And they were like, yeah. I said, okay. So how many hours do you think you spent talking to the client, like sort of getting on board and, getting in touch with the vendors and, any extra stuff you're doing. Cause it turned out they did some like RSVP management stuff and some other really detail-y stuff that normally you would only do if you were doing a full service event. And so they said, we probably each spent about 20 hours. And I said, okay, so let's just say that you guys spent 70 hours, both, right? Between you doing the event on the event day and all of the prep work at the beginning. And they were like, yeah, that's probably right. Like they're looking at each other. They're like, yeah, probably, 70 hours, that's 35 hours a piece or thereabout. And I said, okay, that's awesome, right? So you made $1,700. So that's $1,700, right? Divide by 70 hours. I'm going to save you guys from having to whip out your calculator. It's $24 an hour. And I said, okay, divide by 2, which is $12.14. And I looked them square in the face and I said, you could get a job at In-N-Out Burger and they will pay you more than what you made doing that event. They were like jaw on the ground. They had never thought to do this very simple second grade, third grade math to figure out what they were charging. And so because of that, they were actually driving the dollar down. They were taking that money that they thought was good money, that $1,700 that probably a bazillion planners had turned down doing because you are converting a parking garage all day. You are, it's a massive undertaking. So they should have been paid more to do that job. And they should have probably also not been a day of planner. And also not being a day of planner and giving more than a day of. So, but that type of pricing model of just throwing a number at a wall and seeing if it sticks isn't functional. You just can't do it. And you can't do it and feel and think that you're making money at it. You have to treat this as a business. And so part of that is figuring out, what that money is. And spending more time is not a sustainable model. So if one of them had spent, and they had charged $25 an hour, I mean, even then it feels too cheap, especially for Los Angeles area. Now, I agree that every area has their max caps or their areas where they, like I was saying earlier, you have, what can the market bear? And perhaps the market can bear $25 an hour somewhere else. That is not LA pricing or not even California pricing for that matter at $25 an hour. So I did not see them again the following year at Wedding MBA, whether they came or not, or whether they were still doing it or not. I have no idea. Perhaps I just completely burst their bubble and they went back and were like, this isn't going to work for us. And they were working in other jobs. So it wasn't as if they didn't have some other streams of income, because they did. All right. So now I also recently had a conversation with somebody in my Creative Collective membership. And we were talking about how many hours it takes to plan a wedding. And this is really important, whether it doesn't matter what you do in this industry, knowing how many hours it takes you to do a task on average, whether that be you're shooting an elopement at your photographer, whether that be you're planning an elopement because you're a planner, whether you be, doing a drive-by drop-off service as a caterer, or whether you be doing a full service event as a caterer. Like, you have to know, what does that cost you to do, and how many hours are you going to spend doing it? So here's the straight dope on hours. So a full-time job, full-time, you work 40 hours a week for a year, you get 2 weeks off a year, is 2,080 hours a year, right? So that's really all you have if you want to work regular hours. You don't want to work your butt off nights and weekends and all of these other things. So if you want to treat the job like a job and not treat it like you're working 24/7 and going to have, stage 2 hypertension because you're working all the time and you're busy all the time, and you're drinking too much coffee. So you have to figure, if it's just you and your business, it's 2,080 hours full time. So if you spend, let's just say, 200 hours as an event planner on a month of client, that only means you get 10.4 weddings, right? So at 10.4 weddings at, let's just say, $2,500, you're looking at a gross income of $26,000 a year for doing 10 weddings and keeping you at a full-time job, versus what I think a lot of people are doing, and especially I'm going to keep harping on event planners, floral designers, and the like, is that they're doing closer to 30 and 40 events. And, it depends on how many hours you spend. So we usually spend about 300 hours on a full service client. We're talking like all the bells and whistles, thing is off the hizzy, like, because we have a team of vendors that we work with. So I trust the team to do a lot of the work. I'm not doing other vendors' work for them. That's just not, that is just not in my practice. I do my work, they do their work. Makes sense? So if you are spending, because I talked to the person and they said they spend somewhere around 500 to 700 hours on an event. I was like, what? So if you're spending, 700 hours on an event and there's 2,080 hours in a year, you get to do 3 weddings. So, and if you're spending 7,000 hours a year, that's the equivalent of like 3.3 full-time jobs. That's nuts. Nuts. This is exactly why we have burnout in this industry. And you have to get a handle on really how many hours you're truly using. And our event days are about 17 hours. So I'm figuring 17 hours times 3 people. So that's 51 hours right off the top of what we're actually doing, minus the 350 hours for planning. So I have like 299 hours left. And I'm also, that is a high end estimate on the number of hours, as opposed to something that is much easier. There's obviously clients that are super simple, and I don't have anywhere near the number of hours that I could normally expend on somebody who wants things like, pools that have have covers for dancing on top, or they have a very extensive site search, and a site search can take us 40 hours. So, I mean, I can take that right off the top too. Now I'm at 250 hours. So when you're figuring out what you're charging, and to keep from driving the dollar down, you just have to do some very basic math. And my tips for you are these. Number 1, figure out how many events you want to do, max. Whether it be, 10 full service, 5 month of, whether you are a floral designer and you're like, I can turn out 37 events, because floral designers have a lot more overhead. Caterers, the same thing, the overhead. You have to take all of that out for product and staff that you wouldn't have to take out of a service business or somebody who does entertainment, for example. It's different. So you have to figure out what you want to make, essentially, right? So if your number is $100,000 and you know that you need to make, and you want to work full-time job, right? So 2,080 hours. Your dollar amount per hour is $48, right? Per hour for a year. So you sort of have to figure out, like, you have to take your $100,000 and break it down by how many hours you're going to work with your clients, what your average hours are, and that's going to tell you how much money you need to charge, right? Otherwise, what you're doing is you're just, like I said, you're throwing spaghetti at the wall and you're like, oh my God, I hope they hire me for $3,000, and you're calling from the payphone at Disney World. And that isn't the jam. So you have to get paid a good rate and not be the chipper chicken in the scenario. So all of that being said, how do you know what to charge? So do not waste my time with shopping me. Don't waste your competitors' time shopping them. It's total and complete BS. And it's a waste of time. It gets somebody's hopes up. You're making up stuff. It's crap, right? So how do you know what other people charge in the area? I would strongly suggest you just ask, honestly. And with the caveat that, listen, I'd like for us to be kind of on the same page. I know every event is priced maybe a little bit differently because of the services, but it'd be great if we were all sort of in the same range. Because if you can be in the same range, then it's all about personality. And personality is a really easy win because they like you. And if they like you, they'll pay more for you. And I'll say that, for everybody in the back. If people like you, they will pay more for you. So ask people. Ask people that you have a good relationship with what they charge. But for the love of all things holy, please do not shop your competition. Don't have your friend shop them or your cousin shop them. Just don't do it. So I would strongly encourage you to not do that. Now, with regard to what I charge, I have a range of pricing that I charge. And it depends on the size of the event. It depends on the date or the season of the event. It depends on how many events I'm doing for them. And I charge percentages. I charge design percentages, and I'm very open with that. I tell the clients right up front that I have design percentages, and those percentages are 20% on the rentals, 10 on catering, and 15 on floral. And the client pays me that money. I don't get that from any of the vendors. So which is probably a whole nother podcast, right? But here's my advice to you as a listener of the podcast for creatives. So number one, talk to your competitors or people in your marketplace or other vendors and find out an average rate and as to what services are going for what you want to do, right? Figure out how many hours it takes you to actually do your job, including all of the paperwork that you have to do, all of the event day that you have to do, and figure out what your hourly rate needs to be. So you're not killing yourself working 4,000 to 7,000 hours a year. That is not the jam. You will not take a vacation. And at some point, you'll run into what's called the Peter Principle, which is where you're no longer effective at your job and no longer able to be effective at your job. And you just start dropping balls. So really consider doing all of those things. And I will tell you, you will feel much more confident in the pricing that you are giving to your potential clients. And you will feel much better in the long run about having a really sustainable business. All right? Thanks for joining me for the podcast for creatives. I am so excited that you are here every week. I hope that you will look into the Creative Collective. You can go to the website, which is consultancyforcreatives.com, and you can find information about our membership, the Creative Collective. I would also love it if you would rate this podcast. If you love it, let me know. I would adore that because it means so much to me to be able to share my expertise and share my stories with you. And knowing that it is great and it is going well for you and you are learning something absolutely means the world to me. All right? See you next time.